Of course, I do. And I also identify as an Emiliano, as of somebody coming from the region of Emilia-Romagna. I identify as an Italian. I also identify as a Westerner. And I think that when it comes to understanding European values and the European identity, this needs to be part of it. You can have a multi-layer identity. The important thing as Europeans is that that is a personal choice. The moment an institution, a politician, an influencer tries to put you in a corner and obliges you to just take up one identity out of the identities that you might take, well, that might be a problem. In recent years, there has been a lot of talks about the European identity, the national identity, and the regional identity. For instance, in the recent case of Catalonia and Spain. And I think that identifying as European allows you to have this multi-layer identity. Otherwise, it would be paradoxical to be European only. Somebody, of course, can have the right to feel so, but the important thing is that it is a personal choice. Nobody can tell you what you should feel. So I identify as European, as well as Italian, and as well as an Emiliano. Looking at some previous interviews that this fantastic series has been running, I must admit that I cannot identify one particular formative European moment. Certainly, over the past few years, I have had European formative periods of time. I was lucky enough to serve the cabinet of the President of the European Parliament. I was lucky enough to work closely with Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, who is still the negotiator for Brexit in the European Parliament. I was lucky enough to run the communication for the European Union at the World Expo in Milan. So I've had a number of formative periods, including, of course, the always present Erasmus time. Looking at recent European history, I think I was a bit too young to understand the greatness of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think I wasn't even there when Solidarność started building up. I wasn't even there when the end of the Spanish and the Portuguese dictatorships arrived. So I think it would be unfair for me, who, as I am a millennial, to identify one specific formative moment compared to the latest 70 years of European history. I would say that back in the day, when I was in high school, it was long before I actually joined the European project as an active contributor. I used to get drunk on literature, and some of the Italian correspondence that still today shape the way Italy and Europe are seen in the world, namely, I would say Tiziano Terzani and Oriana Fallaci, from two different political sides, from two different sides of the political spectrum. I think that the first times I read their books, for me, it was a formative European moment. I understood that Italy as a country was part of a larger system, and it was a representative of this system, not only in Europe, but in the world. When it comes to values, when it comes to proposing a model for society. And I think I could have not done that. I was probably 14 or 15 years old. If I hadn't read the books of prominent journalists that were explaining the world to me. So I think that would be probably an unusual, but definitely a very personal European formative moment that still today I cherish. Question. I think it is important to understand the wounds of our society as Europeans. So let's make it clear. I was born in 1986, so this is the history I can look at. And of course, even though I was very little when certain things happened, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, I was not conscious enough at the age of 3 or 4 years old to feel that historic moment. I have to say a couple of things. Definitely, I would say the latest terrorist attacks in a number of European capitals, in Paris, the bombings of in Brussels. Let's not forget that the metro station of the European institutions in Brussels was bombed together with the airport. And I remember that because I was on my way to the airport before the explosion took the lives of many. Same thing in London and same thing in Madrid. These for me were definitely the saddest moment in recent European history. And I'm sorry if I haven't mentioned all the others, including Manchester and Nice. But I would refer to all the terrorist attacks that have happened over the past 20 years. Of course, Europe has seen other types of terrorism before in the 70s and in the 80s, namely in my own country. But for me personally, these were definitely the most touching moments. I would like to make a precision. Many people, when being asked this question, my answer Brexit, because of course, as political analysts, it's very sad to see an important member state leaving. However, today, 8th of October 2020, I would like to say that 4 years on, that didn't seem to be a big wound. I don't think that after Brexit, things will change that much. And I don't think that it can be identified as a horrific moment for the history of Europe. I remember pretty well as a historic moment, I was in Italy with my best friend who happens to be English. And we woke up at 6 a.m. and we went to the kitchen. We were on holiday in Italy, as a matter of fact, and we said together, we have a Brexit. And month after month, we thought that big disasters would come. As negotiations continue today, I think not much will change. Also because probably our British friends were never 100% in the Union. So for respect to the victims of terrorism, I think that those attacks were definitely, in my experience, the worst moment in recent European history. More than a moment, I think that a period of time, which was also, let's say, exacerbated by some specific moment, that was a bad time for European history and for what Europe is today, was the migration crisis in 2015 and 2016. Why is that? Because still today, most of the political and even electoral debate revolves around the issue of migration, mostly in the Mediterranean. So those 1.1 million people arriving on the shores of Europe from the Aegean to the central Mediterranean and to the West Mediterranean were definitely a moment of debate. It was a hard moment for Europe. And I still remember that press conference with, at the time, Commissioner Malmström and the Italian Minister for Internal Affairs, at the time it was Minister Alfano, meeting in Lampedusa to try and find a solution following basically the death of over 300 people that tried to cross the Mediterranean in some dangerous circumstances. Still today, we are debating these issues. Still today, Europe is largely divided on the issue, and still today the issue of migration, especially irregular migration, integration, and a proper asylum reception system is the source of most political debates, even at national and regional levels. So for the sake of clarity, I should add this moment to your previous question. In relation to Brexit, I'm afraid, and as a strong pro-European, I'm afraid that is the case. I'm afraid that showing how nothing much is changing in relation to the relations, in fact, between, in this case, London and Brussels, or let's say the UK and the European Union, these might provide a case study for others who might adventure in some dangerous waters. My country in particular, Italy, over the past few years has expressed the highest levels of Euroscepticism. Should there be a referendum soon, the result would be a negative one. There is a strong wave of Euroscepticism, and I think that the success, so for the moment, of the UK to stall negotiations and somehow not making it look such a disaster as it was announced the day after that referendum day in 2016, will definitely provide a case study. Now, it can be interpreted in two ways. Either, the more federalist way is to say the European Union now is freer to pursue stronger integration. Very good. Unfortunately, as things stand today, I think that another narrative might get momentum. The dangers of populism and extreme nationalism today is still high, and other countries might unfortunately take example. I would be very wary to, let's say, lower the guard on this potential danger for other member states, including founding member states, including my own. In very recent history, but I wouldn't say it's an epical moment. I would say that every European election, there is some kind of danger where anti-European forces, especially in the latest election, would somehow take over the parliament. Well, because if you take over the European Parliament, then legislation is blocked for 5 years if you have anti-European stances. And once again, the latest European election back in May 2019 saw pretty much, without any possible other interpretation, a strong victory from the pro-European side. The Conservative, the Liberals, the Socialists and the Greens have a large majority of the votes, and there is no way the integration process can be stalled in that particular institution. I would say that there is a specific moment, if I have to identify a specific moment, for the European Union, I would say that the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 was very important and highly underestimated. Why is that? Because today we take peace for granted. And I think it is an absolutely fundamental tenet to remind everyone that we are the only union of states that through diplomacy, not through conflict, is maintaining peace for close to a century among states that were belligerent for the entire history of their existence. So I would definitely identify that. I would like to say that I understand this is a rather institutional moment. It's not an iconic moment like the fall of the Berlin Wall, of the end of the wars in the Balkans. But of course, it's also the institutions that can send messages, pragmatic messages, to build a union of state that is sustainable in the future. So I would identify the latest victory of most pro-European parties in the European elections, even though there were serious threats that anti-European parties would take over the institution, and there were the victory of the award of the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2012, which was taken collegially by all the presidents of the three main institutions of the Union. While this might not be something very practical, I think it is something huge for most of us, and that most of us who enjoy the benefits of living in a peaceful union of states that pursues prosperity, democracy, and freedom. And we always take it for granted still today. I think that Europe, the European Union, and its current architecture opened my mind. I wouldn't mention the Erasmus, the Euro, the roaming charges, The fact that I'm now in Malta and I lived in Belgium, I'm an Italian citizen, and I don't need a specific permit to work. I wouldn't say that. I think that the most important thing is to open my mind. Now, why is this important? Because in the current social economic system of the world, having a larger, broader vision on how things work globally gives you an invincible comparative advantage to any other society that doesn't provide that. Unfortunately, I think that this is still underestimated consistently by most European citizens. The opportunities to have a vision not only on your city, your region, your country, and your continent makes you more competitive in the global market. It is through competition of ideas that societies prosper, and without the opportunity to understand how other countries are working compared to yours, other businesses are working in different countries compared to yours, how you as an individual are pursuing your career, your dreams, your ambitions, compared to others in different countries in the same union that have different systems, makes you more competitive globally. And that comes together with the idea of a European identity. I think that understanding, acknowledging to feel European also comes with the acknowledgement that you will have, for sure, just because you're born and you're an active citizen of the European Union, you will have a comparative advantage compared to anybody else in the world. So definitely, to sum it up, a broader vision on Europe, a broader vision on the world, but also a broader vision on myself as an individual in a global society. Europe is, well, the European Union is an institution of acronyms and dates. Before 2020, everything was, what about 2020? What are we going to see in 2020? And now that we are in 2020, everything is about 2030. As I like to be quite pragmatic, I'm not a fan of slogans. I don't want to say I would just want a greener or a pinker or a rainbow Europe. What I'd like to see is a European Union, with a bigger budget. Why is that? Because the whole narrative on the European Union is based on two lines of thoughts. The European Union is too powerful, the European Union is not powerful enough. In either case, there is a mismatch. So in the first case, the European Union gets allocated wrongly a power it doesn't have. Still today, the biggest decisions are in the hands of the member states that meet in the European Council. Even today, we are about to have a council on a new ambitious migration pact, but still the final decision will not be in the hands of the Commission, it will be in the hands of individual member states or in clusters of member states, usually working together geographically. Now, the European Union today has a budget corresponding to 1.14% points of GDP per country. How can an institution that only has this tiny allocation of resources actually legislate, provide a vision, provide a working program for 500 million citizens, finding a compromise among 27 member states, maybe more in the years to come? Pragmatically, I would like to see a bigger budget for the European Union, so a bigger pooling of resources among member states to work on a common project. And most importantly, back in 2014, I remember the latest State of the Union by President Barroso. I know it's a catchphrase, but it's still imprinted in my head. Europe should be big on the big things and small on the small things. For Europe, I would like to see in 2030 less competencies, but more competence in big portfolios. Still today, the European Union is under threat of the individual decision of member states when it comes to important issues like migration, economic recovery, the job market, a European industrial policy, defense, our position in NATO, our border control. Well, these are decisions that matter way more than other smaller types of competencies that could be still in the hands of national member states or even regions. What I'd like to see is a more agile Europe that is very strong, decided, and direct on big topics, and that delegates smaller topics to its member states. I think that will also be the key to turn this completely polarized narrative on Europe. If it was stronger on the bigger things, then the debate of Europe would be more passionate for sure, and even it would attract a bigger interest from citizens that today just see a sort of, allow me the comparison, the English literature comparison, a sort of Leviathan that legislates upon member states without them being taken into consideration, rather than, you know, an actual system that allows countries together to be stronger. There are two definitions of being an EU influencer. The first one is technical. So every year, a fantastic communication consultancy called ZN organizes this gala award, and they put up an algorithm to identify who in the Twitter sphere of the so-called Euro bubble, meaning everybody working in European affairs, attracts the most attention when they speak. Pretty much, this is the technical definition. So it's an algorithm that looks at your followers, your retweets, the comments you generate, the likes you generate, and so on. And so every year they do that, and I've been fortunate enough to have been nominated since the beginning of this prize. But then there is a real definition. So to cut a long story short, there has been an important debate in marketing today about the role of influencers in general and how they can be defined. So an EU influencer, of course, is somebody that, when talking about European affairs, is listened to. So it might shift somebody's opinion, or his or her opinion might be sought for, meaning that I want to have an opinion on a specific topic. I see that some people are influential in that specific topic, whether this be migration, economics, transport, health, foreign policy. So I'm going to see what they think about a specific topic, and I'm going to do that publicly. Now, that public interaction influences the conversation on the topic, and so the whole debate is influenced by that specific person. So, and this applies not only to politics or European affairs, it applies to everything. As you well know, the words influencers are more applied today in marketing when it comes to things like fashion, like fitness, like art, like food. And later, the idea of being an influencer in politics came about. I think it is a very interesting field to study institutional communication, because basically we have created, let's say as communication professional, a new figure which is beyond journalists and policymakers. So you have this hybrid figure. They might not be journalists, they might not politicians, they might not pass laws or legislate, but because they're knowledgeable or because they have a specific style, they influence the debate. And this is what today an EU influencer is about. I think that this point actually defines what EU institutional communication should do in the next few years if they want to avoid a significant disaster. There's a set of data, and this helps me also define citizens somewheres and citizens anywheres, that are telling us a couple of things about European citizens today. So 40% of European citizens today, so in 2019 to be precise, 40% have never set foot abroad. So even in the Union of States that have facilitated movement of people in any kind of circumstance, business, pleasure, family reunification, holidays, and so on, 40%, so almost half European citizens have never set foot abroad. I'm not saying, they don't work abroad. As I said, they've never set foot abroad. This tells us one thing. Most European citizens are born, live, and die in one particular territory. And most of them are still attached, eradicated. They're close to the traditions of the territory they belong to, and they're close to their community. They don't have today a large, broader vision on what is outside of the borders of their territory. Of course, this has changed a lot. I think that back in the 80s, this figure was 70%. But what this tells us is that the European narrative of the mobile citizen that is continuously moving between Brussels, Berlin, Milan, London, and going on holiday everywhere, well, it's not true. This is still a highly privileged segment of society that can enjoy a single market. And the second piece of data I'd like to give is that the percentage of citizens in the European Union that are born in a place and live in another is 3.3%, Eurostat data 2019. If you look at a couple of, let's say, exceptional examples, I think that this figure in Romania is about 20%, and in Bulgaria is roughly that, I think a bit less. That means that citizens coming from Western Europe that live in another in other member states of the European Union is 0.0x percent. So this European mobility, this continuous European diaspora inside the continent doesn't really exist. It's a couple of million people, but it's not the majority of Europeans, contrary to what a number of institutions are pushing as a message. And this is important to acknowledge. So citizens anywhere are citizens that are detached from belonging to a specific territory or a specific territorial community. They are light-hearted, they're mostly liberal progressives. They care about big topics like the environment, like gender equality, like fighting discrimination, fighting racism. They have an understanding of society which is more fluid, and they are less interested in day-to-day topics, including the economy or jobs or the market or competition from abroad and so on. They make the most out of the single market. They understood the opportunities that the European Union setting is providing to them, and they really are on the full throttle to make sure that as individuals, they take advantage fully of the opportunity of mobility. They study abroad, and also the funny thing is that geographically, they tend to be in large urban centers, mostly capitals, and they are closer to each other than they are closer to the peripheries of their cities. What do I mean? Let's say people working in international affairs in Vienna, Brussels, Berlin, Milan, London are closer to each other, also thanks to the digital market, than they are closer to, let's say, they're closer to the areas of Potsdam, the areas of Lodi outside of Milan, the areas of the periphery of Madrid, or the areas of Reading in London. So they are closer to these communities than they are to the peripheries. Now, then you have the rest. So then you have citizens somewheres. Somewheres are citizens that are eradicated in a place. They feel they belong to that place, and they are not interested in topics that go beyond their direct proximity, both when it comes to knowing people and also to issues that interest them. Today, somewheres are probably 90 or 80% of Europeans. What I put in my blog is that, unfortunately, and I think that's a mistake, European institutions are more interested in communicating to anywheres that already know the advantages of the single market and everything that relates to that, rather than somewheres who don't know, are not reached by the messages that the European single market doesn't only benefit citizens that travel, but thanks to competition, thanks to openness, thanks to freedom of circulation of goods, services, and people, they are creating more wealth for them indirectly. So this is my warning. I would say it's time that institutional communication from the European Union goes towards the 80% that don't know the benefits of Europe. And I'm not saying they forget, but less effort are needed now towards the 20% that are already mobile, they travel, and they know the benefits of being together in a union of 27 rather than in separate individual states. Yes, I think so. Now, disinformation and false news have always happened. So I think that lately the disinformation and fake news are depicted as something that is relatively new. Unfortunately, that's not the case. What it's new, it's the amplitude, the power that information at large can have at its disposal to travel, and the speed, most importantly. I mean, um, anybody that is studying history knows that the whole history of mankind is a story of disinformation and false news. If you go to Egypt, where you see the first actually written columns that can be dated back to almost 5,000 years ago, you can see that every pharaoh, the first thing they would do was to cancel the previous pharaoh's achievements. So they would rewrite history and so spreading disinformation. And you see that in most of Roman military history, most Roman generals, the first thing they would do was to spread disinformation so that the enemy would be tricked into making a mistake. Now, let's define well fake news, disinformation, and misinformation, and then let's define how these affects the European narrative. Now, false news, so false news are news that are factually incorrect. Not to be mistaken with news that you may disagree with, that may manipulate certain interpretations. False news are without a doubt wrong. So this is it, not to be confused with manipulation or with news that you might disagree with, which is unfortunately a tendency among anywhere citizens to label fake news as something they simply disagree with, which is a big mistake. Disinformation is the strategic application of, the strategic, how can I say, coordination of false news in order to build a false narrative. That is disinformation, and that is intentional. So I spread a number of false news so that the image of a specific thing, of a specific institution, of a specific person is damaged by false information. Misinformation, however, is not the same. Misinformation is helping disinformation, but unintentionally. What do I mean? Disinformation, for instance, is a campaign through which, by spreading inflammatory headlines, you try to get a narrative get larger. Misinformation is, I see an inflammatory heading, and due to the feeling this triggers in my heart, I want to share that feed so that I can damage more the people that are targeted by that campaign. So the difference lies in the intention. Disinformation is intentional, misinformation is unintentional. How will this affect the European Union? In my research, I noticed that anti-European forces, and here I include parties, movements, or individual figures, are a lot more prepared when it comes to spreading disinformation, and they seem to be highly motivated in doing so. So they have a motive, and they have a structure, and they have a network through which they can spread disinformation fast and irreparably. Once something is out, since the market is completely unregulated, it's too late to repair. So this is why I see it's going to be a danger. And to respond to your question, yes, COVID-19 has exacerbated that simply because COVID-19 has caused people spending more and more time online. So disinformation hasn't changed. What has changed is the amount of exposure that people get to information at large, and consequently to disinformation, simply because more time is spent online. Now, the European Union, I know, is working towards ways to fight disinformation factually. And unfortunately, what has happened over the past few years is that a number of organisms have started their own disinformation action, but it's today uncoordinated. The only way that the European Union or the institutions that at the level of member states, because of course information travels freely across borders, the things that it can do is to bring a hub of all these organisms that are fighting disinformation individually, so bring them together for a pan-European action against disinformation. Unfortunately, today, the anti-European forces are a lot stronger when it comes to implementing disinformation campaigns. And I have to admit, though, that Europe is aware of that. And they're now trying to fight this absolute plague with any means possible. In case of member states, that depends on one thing. Now, we cannot talk about member states. We need to talk about governments that are in charge, or political parties that anyway are working to sell, to present their programs. Well, that depends if they want to. So if it is not a priority for them, they don't necessarily have to. And this is something that needs to be acknowledged. The problem here is the communication of values. Now, unfortunately, and a recent study by ICMPD and by the Overseas Development Institute are showing exactly a terrible mistake that has been made mostly by the liberal progressive side when communicating large pan-European issues, which is communicating values as I would say as unattackable tenets, while values are actually personal, and they have a construction which is completely individual. The construction of values comes from your own history as an individual, your family background, your current situation, the experiences you have had in your life, how your community, how your society is living around you. And the point is that communicating a value as an attackable will always generate the opposite feeling that you expect. So what I would say is this: these sentiments of disenfranchisement, whether it is generated by a government or by the European institutions, is generated by a mismatch of values. What do I say? If you're communicating the value of universalism to somebody that cherishes the value of personal security more, that message will be rejected. And unfortunately, what the European institutions are doing still today is exactly that. They are communicating values to people who don't share them. And by doing that, they delegitimize the value itself. And unfortunately, this is today the root of populism. Populism has been generated because of that, because of the delegitimization of values, so that people that have a more today conservative or traditional approach to society don't feel represented by this type of campaigning. One specific practical set of mistake that I can identify in my field, which is analyzing the migration narrative, or in my work over the past 10 years, which is analyzing the European narrative, is the use of certain words. Certain words like sexist, racist, fascist, unfortunately today have lost value. Why is that? Because there is a wrong tendency to overuse these terms to people who are not actual sexist, actual racist, or actual fascist. These are heavy insults. Unfortunately, what I see today is a tendency, mostly by people belonging to the Anywheres group in Europe, to label people that disagree with their vision of the world with these words. By using these words, people that hear it will embrace it at a certain point. They say, like, why do you still call me that? I'm not a racist, I'm not a fascist, I'm not a sexist. I just think that certain policies would be better in a different way, and certain policies do not reflect my values. And unfortunately, by keep using these unfortunate set of words, what has happened today is that citizens feel disenfranchised. And as a rejection of the message, they will embrace these labels with pride. So this is what I'm saying. So what can member states and European institutions do is to be very careful with the language, meaning that if they want to promote certain policies, they should do so without impinging on somebody's values. So they should stick to, I would say, communicating policies in a way that benefits the audience. Now, in terms of the European Union, the job is a lot different and it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to convey uncountable messages to local communities in their own language rather than running pan-European campaigns in English. So that would be an easy task. And I think that something practical that the European Union can do today is exactly to invest on micro-targeting. You will never be able, so the European society today is not united, is not a monolith. So the only way to do that, to reverse this narrative, to make citizens be represented and not disenfranchised as they feel today, is to communicate in their language, respecting values they care about, and focusing on policies they're really concerned about, especially today as an economic recession is definitely looming over Europe. That is definitely the time to do so, the time to have a new turning point in European communication targeted to communities, not to large segments of society that do not share the same values today and do not even understand maybe one common language. I'm not just referring to English as a vehicular language. I'm also talking about the various acronyms or the various slogans that are used. Sometimes outside of the anywhere sphere, these messages are not easy to understand, and this is causing, unfortunately, a larger distance between the institutions and the citizens. In the latest State of the Union by Ursula von der Leyen, this particular sentence was repeated a number of times, which is we have to be united in diversity. The interpretation of united in diversity means to be proud of your differences. And actually, by being proud of your differences and finding common ground on things we can cooperate about as member states, as region, as individuals, is exactly what makes unions in general strong, because you can decide to focus on what brings you together rather than what sets you apart. When it comes to languages, it is absolutely fundamental that Europeans do not feel disenfranchised if they don't speak English, French, or German. especially since we are having a new way of regionalism, especially in certain member states. Even there, an effort should be made. Languages are also carriers of history and identity. I live now in a country where people are bilingual or even trilingual. I live in Malta. Maltese is the national language. Everybody speaks English. Most people also speak Italian. However, the Maltese language is a construct of the history of this island, and it would be impossible to communicate Europe, to communicate a narrative, to communicate a vision for a conglomerate of states that decide to work together without acknowledging the importance of that specific history and identity carrier. So yes, linguistic diversity is fundamental to rebuild the European narrative today on all its issues. Doing otherwise, so pushing only messages in certain languages that are still today, actually, while there has been a significant improvement in terms of education, but they're still today in the hands of few, it would be a strong mistake. I think it is the time with the new commission and with the new, unfortunately, economic crisis to turn the page and to provide more communication in all the languages of the European Union and beyond. Thank you for your question. The first thing to do is to agree among all political actors that migrants cannot be used in the building of a balanced migration narrative as political pawns. They cannot be used as pawns that can be moved, that can be equalized, that can be rebalanced or misused just to fulfill political gains. This needs to be agreed among all political pawns because we're talking about the lives of people, we're talking about the lives of communities where new people are trying to integrate and be part of. And on the other side, where the communities, the communes, the regions, the member states are working to make sure there is harmony in this new society they are built. A new balanced narrative on migration is based on this, is based on avoiding to feed the poles of the debate and making concrete efforts to bring the conversation back to the center. That doesn't mean that politicians, ministers, even citizens cannot disagree. It's very good to disagree as long as the debate is civil and as long as inflammatory language doesn't affect the lives of those who are trying to make this work. Let's not forget that if you take any book of history, you will see that the history of mankind, it's a history of movement. Since the agricultural revolution some 14,000 years ago, men have moved. They have moved towards situations, towards territories that provided them individually and to their families and to their close community a better opportunity for a better life. This will not change. The responsibility of countries, of institutions, and of international organizations is to facilitate a system where this movement of people works for everybody. And this cannot be done without a balanced narrative where people are not taken as a sort of instrument for electoral gains or as speculation to find a common enemy to feed even more inflammatory situations or incendiary situations that do not benefit society. This, for me, would be the main tenet to re-establish a new balanced narrative on migration for Europe and beyond. Another thing about that we should consider when talking about the migration narrative is that today, unfortunately, in Europe, when we talk about migration, we are actually talking about irregular migration. And that is wrong for the simple fact that most of the migration flows around Europe and towards Europe and I can say from Europe are safe, regular, and monitored. The migration narrative is completely polarized because today, when we look at the news and we see the words migrants, actually what they mean is irregular migrants. And this is the problem. So, before I said that the value of certain words has disappeared. Today, we're living the same thing with the word migrant. I am a migrant. You are a migrant, as I understand. My partner is a migrant. My family has been a migrant. Have been migrants for a long time. My mom herself, she was born in France, since my grandfather went there in 1946 because the economy of Italy was completely devastated. But they are not seen today. I'm not seen as a migrant today. This is the problem. So the word migrant has lost its actual semantic meaning. If we talk about refugees, let's talk about refugees. If we talk about asylum seekers, let's talk about asylum seekers. If you're talking about wealthy diasporas moving, let's talk about that. Unfortunately, to help to feed this polarization in the language, everything now has been put under this migrant funnel, so that it's hard for people that do not work in this specific field to discern the different type of migration flows that are occurring on the fringes and inside or internally in Europe. I give you an example. All the news we hear about migration in Europe come from today, unfortunately, the Aegean, the Central Mediterranean, and sometimes these last few months in the West Mediterranean. Let's not forget that following the occupation of Crimea by Russia, it is estimated that almost 1 million Ukrainians went in Europe towards Poland or towards other Central European countries. But that doesn't make the news because of a number of reasons. But these are migrants. So a balanced migration narrative is a narrative where words have meanings, where the words that need to say something are not, how can I say, in English I would say, maybe these two can cut because I got a bit lost, but what I want to say is that it's important that words maintain their values. Yes, the Schengen Union is for EU citizens. So what you mentioned doesn't really contrast the narrative around it. So it is a privilege for citizens of the European Union to travel freely around Schengen. So there it's more of a legal matter, in my opinion. And the narrative around it, if it doesn't back up the legal framework that is established and it's clear, then it would be a wrong narrative. It's not about not letting or letting people move. Legally, this is a privilege, it's a right for citizens of the European Union. This should be, unfortunately, the end of the story. I think that the narrative about non-Europeans non-Europeans not being able to travel as freely as Europeans, I think is strongly linked to the overall migration narrative, but that is a wrong way to describe it, because there are facts. So the fact is that the Union has these laws that applies to these people, and that's it. Linking it to other migratory phenomena that are still part of the overall migration debate in Europe would be conceptually wrong and would create even more confusion to the public. My suggestion is that migration policy gets solved collegially by all member states, and you will see that all other issues related, for instance, to internal mobility will be solved at the same time. I don't think you can have both. You need to have both at the same time. You cannot have either to have a balanced migration narrative, both when it comes to migration into Europe and migration, well, let's say movement of people inside the Union. I don't think it will change it. I think it will perhaps slow down a process that has begun, even though it is not fully spread yet, but a process has begun where Europeans are more aware about the opportunities to move, whether it is on vacation, whether it is just for interest, whether it is for business. So I think it will definitely slow it down, also because the fact that we are now constrained to our locations made us also understand that a lot of traveling was not really necessary, which brings some interesting benefits. For instance, cleaner air, cleaner seas, less pollution, less consumption, and so on. So there are pros and cons about this phenomenon. Of course, Europeans are people that are very close to each other, especially in the south, where I come from. We tend to greet each other with kisses on the cheek. We hug each other a lot. Human contact is a fundamental element of, I would say, most European countries. Now, will that change the narrative? I think it will slow it down a little bit. But on the other hand, let's not forget that apart from the actual travels that we do physically, taking a flight, taking a train, crossing a border with our car, more exposure to digital content also is somehow broadening our perspective, our vision on Europe. What needs to happen then is that more content about the overall European opportunities, society, politics, and work of the European Union is promoted in these tools, in these networks. What do I mean by that? While we have the opportunity to expand our vision without borders, thanks to technology, there needs to be an effort by the institutions to make sure that their messages arrive to these people. Because what seems to happen over the past few years is that while we have this opportunity to expand our vision, we are actually trying to, and unfortunately, social networks algorithms are actually pushing you to building parallel realities. So while I have the opportunity now to inquire about something happening in Finland or in Ireland or in Romania, social networks are actually pushing you towards building your own reality based on your close interactions. I think a discussion between governments, even institutions of the European Union, together with those that are in charge of these social networks could happen in order to promote, which is something very good, a different way to understand society via our digital tools. So to answer your question, yes, it will have an impact on mobility in Europe, but let's not forget that mobility is not only physical. It's also digital, it's also mobility of ideas, it's also mobility of communication, it's also mobility of exchange that doesn't need to happen physically. I find it sad that, of course, the human exchange is limited today, but we need to adapt. As a society, as a free society, we have the means to adapt. We have the means to make sure that competitive business models and competitive ideas somehow attract a specific market. I think that is the time to make sure that getting out of this pandemic safely will also be accompanied by a way that keeps us together rather than pushing us towards our little core, our little caps where we don't want to see the rest of the world outside of us because maybe it's uncomfortable or because, let's not forget, it might just be more profitable for companies to push ads that keep you in your own little bubble. This is a big discussion. I'm happy that many theorists are looking into this, and I'm happy that also social networks are opening the conversation about the future of mobility of ideas in light of a pandemic and in light of a situation where currently people, not only Europe, but all around the world, are confined to their homes or definitely to their territories for an indefinite period of time, and which I hope seriously that it will resolve fast in a safe and secure manner for everyone.